So welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Craig Peters. I'm a product manager at JFrog. JFrog is a vendor of the Universal Binary Repository Manager. We're a sponsor here. Love to come chat with you. I am responsible for our partner relationships and the integrations we do with a set of partners, and I'm very honored to be here to moderate a panel with some really awesome people who know a ton about Spinnaker that I don't. So if you don't know a lot about Spinnaker and you want to learn a ton more, you're in a great place, because I'm going to ask questions that are selfish for me about understanding the Spinnaker ecosystem and how we all can work together to make continuous delivery and deployment a much more seamless part of our whole CI infrastructure. So I want to start with a quick disclaimer. The disclaimer is that the views and positions and information you receive in this panel are the views of all of us as individuals, the 6 of us here on the panel as individuals, and don't represent the views of our company. That leaves us free to express ourselves and bring our points of view into this discussion, and I hope that's fruitful for all of us. I hope that's okay. So I'm going to start real quickly with a quick introduction to each of our panelists, just so you know who we're talking to. And then we'll start with some questions. I'll ask a few. I'm going to encourage the panelists to ask each other questions, because we don't all know each other or what we've all done. And then I'm going to invite the audience to ask some questions, and we'll go from there. Hope that works for everybody. So let me start with Richard. Richard is a vice president at JPMorgan Chase. He's responsible for the delivery of public cloud toolchain services. He's got 25 plus years of experience in IT. He's got kind of a split career, both on the application development and architecture side and the infrastructure engineering and architecture. He's experienced in strategic technology planning and implementation. He's solutions architecture, software development, and systems integration. So that's Richard, awesome dude. Now we've got Raja. Raja is senior manager and tech lead at Capital One. He's leading the DevOps team responsible for extending Spinnaker and integrating with Capital One services. Prior to Capital One, he worked as a tech lead at VeriSign, leading the development of their domain registration platform. So that's Raja. Ethan is a community software engineer with Armory and has been involved with the Spinnaker community for the last 2 years. Hold on, isn't the Spinnaker community only 1.5? No, 2 years. He's worked with countless companies to help drive Spinnaker adoption within their organizations. He's worked throughout the software stack and experienced the pain of software delivery at every level, from writing and deploying operating software that drives business value. Fatih is a principal developer at Ericsson, product development unit for 5G. He specializes in automation, CI/CD, and DevOps, and is currently involved in several large-scale CI/CD activities. He's a member of the OPNFV Technical Steering Committee, Nordic's Technical Steering Committee, technical lead of OPNFV Cross-Community CI, also known as XCI, and co-founder of the OpenCI initiative, working on establishing CI/CD principles and practices in the industry and across open source. And then last, there's Ben. Ben is a senior reliability engineer for Pure Storage's cloud teams. Ben is driving the deployment of Spinnaker at Pure and evangelizing the adoption of it. Before joining Pure, Ben was an SRE at Live Minds, which was acquired by Seagate. Ben has many years of experience in designing and implementing solutions at scale. Ben graduated from the University of Adelaide, majoring in computer science. So I hope you'll all agree that we've got a really awesome panel here. And with that, I will start with the first question, and I'm going to ask you gentlemen to use your microphones that are in front of you. And I guess let's start with Ben, and then move across for this first question, and then we'll kind of mix it up from there. So the first question is just kind of a softball to get introduced about like what you're doing actually today with Spinnaker. So the question is, where is your organization in the CD deployment journey, like in the journey of adopting this stuff, and what role does Spinnaker play in that infrastructure?
Sure. Our company, we've been in production with Spinnaker now for just over a year, and it's really helping us migrate more towards CD than CI. In that CI, you have like manual intervention steps before it goes to production, where CD is continuous delivery without the human in the middle. That's my understanding of it anyway. So Spinnaker is certainly encouraging us to move more towards CD and helping with that. I would say that I've seen probably 14 or 15 pipelines going through that actually are true continuous delivery, and that's been a result of us adopting Spinnaker.
For how long have you been working on that?
I'd probably say that there's been within the last 6 months we've hit it with those ones, but there is a whole bunch of other stuff with CI, and CI has a place as well.
Thank you. Fatih.
Yeah, Ericsson, we have been doing continuous deployment for quite many years, starting with 3G networks. But traditionally, telecom networks built using like purpose-built hardware and monolith software. And even though we have been doing continuous deployment and with all this cloud virtualization, cloud native transformation going on across telecom industry, the telecom applications are getting containerized and pushed into cloud type of infrastructure. And even though we have been doing continuous deployment, the new technologies and new concepts require us to approach the continuous deployment way of doing things in different way based on the new technologies. And I'm new in Spinnaker. A few months ago I started working with Spinnaker, but internally at Ericsson we have been using Spinnaker for orchestrating application development internally. And we haven't started looking into using Spinnaker for pushing stuff to production yet, because telecom networks are kind of a bit complicated comparing to IT type of workloads. But we are on a journey, and I'm sure we will get the most out of Spinnaker hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think my perspective is probably going to be a bit different from those on the rest of the panel. I've gotten to see kind of the adoption of Spinnaker from both sides. So before Armory, I was at a company called Squid, where I drove adoption of Spinnaker as a software delivery platform. So we were deploying to Kubernetes. So it's a very similar experience to probably everyone here, where they're rolling out Spinnaker internally. But then I joined Armory, and not only do I get to use Spinnaker and work on Spinnaker, but we actually get to help people adopt Spinnaker within their organizations too. So we're working with companies at a lot of different levels of adoption. So we have customers who come to us who have already used open source Spinnaker, and they're looking to use some of the features that we layer on top. We have people who are just coming into learning Kubernetes and Spinnaker at the same time. So it's really like we get a lot of experience, and we see kind of the different challenges I think that people have. And so by getting to work, by bringing in kind of personal experience from driving adoption, but also seeing customers also try to face those challenges, I think we're just kind of helping build a better platform to make that easier for everyone here and everyone who's joined us.
Awesome, thanks. Raja.
Hey, so at Capital One, there are a lot of big lines of businesses like card or bank or tech. So I work for the tech division called ShareTech, and my team is basically responsible for taking Spinnaker from open source and extending it, adding integration with our services that our team offers on that platform. And there are a lot of different DevOps teams as well in different lines of businesses. They are maybe using Jenkins or something else. So what my journey has been for past 1 year or so, it's been like trying to bring this Spinnaker development into Capital One and showcase how it's a better tool than a simple Jenkins pipeline, and basically showcase the talent or the features that it offers in the CI/CD space.
Cool. Okay, so at JPMorgan Chase, I mean, Jenkins has been our continuous integration engine for a while. We've extended it to do deployment. What got us down the road of, and so we've been doing continuous deployment for a while. We've actually invested and built out a homegrown deployment engine that's agent-based. So a lot of the orchestration, though, has been done by Rundeck and also done by Jenkins. I think what got us down the road of thinking about a better alternative was the fact that these things called cloud platforms came into to being, right? We weren't all about bare metal and virtualization. So the Spinnaker, we wrote a white paper, myself and a colleague wrote a white paper that said, what are we doing today? So what are the CI/CD tools that we use? And off the back of that, we said, what's their capabilities and what's the capabilities that we need? So we weren't so focused on tooling, but we do feel that Spinnaker could be a really nice match to some of the things that we weren't doing so well, especially for cloud platforms.
Cool, thank you. So I think that a couple of you guys hit on the next question that we had planned on, and we'll switch things up as we go, but I think it actually works really well. So, you know, Ben, you kind of talked about moving away from CI, although you say there's CI as a role. You know, we've talked about CI as kind of part of the whole ecosystem of your DevOps tooling. You know, the question is, you know, sort of which comes first? Is it CI? Is it CD? Does it matter? Like, how do we as organizations, and why would we kind of do one before the other? And how should that affect how we adopt these kinds of tools? So let's start. I think we'll start with Ethan, I think, in this one, if that's fair, and then we'll go around.
Yeah, so which one comes first? I think that's an interesting question, because obviously if you don't have anything to deploy, then you can't really deploy, right? So if you don't take care of CD or CI, or you don't have a way of building an artifact to deploy, then there's nothing to deploy. But I also think that CI is actually the easiest part. When you think about actually integrating code and building code and running tests, maybe just unit tests, that's a bit easier. But tools like Spinnaker help solve the complex issue that is CD, or just software delivery in general. Because we all, when you start doing kind of like immutable deployments, you're actually just taking a single artifact and promoting it across environments. And so the fact that we have a bunch of different environments with a bunch of different perhaps requirements, that's where the complexity comes in. So even though CI and testing kind of naturally comes first, I think the part of the problem that needs kind of the most attention and the most understanding is delivery. So you might argue that might come first in your thinking, but maybe not implementation.
That makes a lot of sense. Fatih, I think you have something to say here. And
Can we have disagreements here?
I'm particularly curious about kind of the gray area between the last bit of testing that you do for CI and when you're creating the artifact, and what is that artifact that you're moving to different environments?
My response to this question will be a bit non-technical, because continuous integration, continuous delivery, or if we go back a bit more agile way of working, it's more social than technical. So if developers are not working, or if they're not in a habit of pushing code to master branch or integrating their changes to master frequently, which is the definition of CI, you can't have continuous delivery, because in order for you to build some artifacts and push them through your pipelines and reach to production in the end, you need to have some code coming into your Git repository. So that's why I feel like without CI, the rest is nearly impossible, because you don't develop anything. And when we generally get into this type of conversations, we end up in talking about tools generally. And that is one of the crucial things in CI/CD and DevOps domain, is that we shouldn't really forget about human aspects of this journey. And the Spinnaker, okay, it's a great tool. It orchestrates different tools and so on, and it enables you to achieve continuous delivery and deployment. But one of the good things about Spinnaker is that it demonstrates concepts and principles and practice of continuous delivery. While doing that, one must not forget about continuous integration as well, and that, in my opinion, should go first to get developers in a habit to push code frequently rather than staying on branch for weeks.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I hand the mic to Ben, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what you meant by moving sort of to CD from CI.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when I said we had 14 things roughly on CD, that was a very small fraction of things that we actually have on Spinnaker. So we've certainly taken the approach of solving the CI part of it and getting the frequent commit, as you're talking about, into building an artifact that then goes onto an image and then goes on for some testing. And then we have like a manual step. And that's what I'm defining is that's the difference between, that's the CI's over there and now someone has to go make a decision. And certainly the CD part is super complex. And I completely agree with Ethan on that part is it's that getting that to be robust, using things like Canary and other tools to do that judgment that a human normally would do and do it in a way that you have confidence and know that it's going to be right every time or it'll roll back every time. And that's super hard, and I think Spinnaker's got a lot to offer there. So that hopefully that clarifies
I think it
where I'm
does.
coming from. But to answer your original question, I think the first thing the software engineer has to solve is the CI part and get their team committing frequently and get it to a pipeline that is CI, just be practical here, with a manual judgment step until that you've signed off on all the CD components.
That makes sense. So, Richard, do you have anything to add to that point of view?
I think Spinnaker has an opinion, right? Spinnaker says, I'll listen to Jenkins. Spinnaker has this Jenkins stage, right? So I think in some ways you think about the Uber orchestrator, what orchestrates what. But for CI in terms of, continuous change, you have to have architecture that supports it, right? There's a cloud native architecture, microservices where your apps are. So there's a lot of complexity to even make that work. But when I think of Spinnaker, it's almost got an opinion about itself saying, hey, I'll be Uber orchestrator, I'll call Jenkins. And different perspective, but I think there's boundaries around these tools, right? Which tool makes what capability a first-class citizen? Think about testing, right? Unit testing versus Cayente. Does Spinnaker do Cayente well? Would you go into Jenkins and try to script yourselves into a test methodology and set a test and pull in metrics and make those decisions with Jenkins? It doesn't do that really well. So I think the differentiation is Spinnaker it does things very well, but then Jenkins natively does other capabilities very well. So it's a clean separation in many cases.
So, yeah, I think, Raja, do you have a point of view about where that separation may lie?
So yes, so at Capital One we also follow similar process where Spinnaker acts as a master orchestrator. So a code commit triggers my pipeline in Spinnaker, and we basically then trigger a CI system on Jenkins, which creates the artifact. And then the artifact is like pushed through different stages in the pipeline from dev, staging to prod. And within all these publishing of the artifact, we have to go and validate several things like whether functional testings are good or performance testing results are good. So all those things are not built into Spinnaker yet. What at Capital One we are trying to do is create some custom stages and trying to bring that intelligence into our pipeline and trying to force this change onto our
So in
teams.
that scenario, Spinnaker then really does act as the orchestrator of those other things. So that's really interesting. And actually, I don't know if any other people's heads are going there. I have a little bit of an NFV background, and it makes me want to ask Fatih, because there's a big debate within NFV about sort of who is the orchestrator of orchestrators, right? and everybody wants to orchestrate everybody else, and we've all been in this industry long enough to see the many iterations of the master scheduler, and there's a little bit of that notion coming along here. If we start making it so that Spinnaker can do anything, is Spinnaker the right place to become, say, the orchestrator of virtual network functions?
Well, if you ask this question to other telecom people, they might answer ONUP, Open Network Automation Platform, which is an orchestrator management and orchestration open source project to deal with VNF, virtual network functions onboarding. Now, the thing is Spinnaker is great for orchestration things, but we last maybe 5-10 years, we have this transformation going on within the telecom industry, and IT industry is also doing cool stuff that will be useful for telecom industry. But we need these industries like telecom and traditional telecom and IT industries to come together to find a common way forward. Because if you look at telecom industry, they come up with their own solutions, and IT do the similar things. And there are probably quite many overlaps between all these orchestration challenges and management challenges, because in the end, virtual network functions or containerized or cloud native network functions, there are applications as well. And that's what Spinnaker does as well, pushing applications to cloud infrastructure. And I can't say if Spinnaker can be that one, but I think there are lots of opportunities to collaborate further between the industries to find better ways of doing things. So that's, I can't be political, but I'm trying my best to be political here. Because I am coming from telecom and I am working in the Linux Foundation networking projects as open source developer, and there is a lot of interest in management and orchestration, and Spinnaker is something we are looking in our project, open network, open platform for network functions virtualization. And that's one of the reasons why we are looking into Spinnaker to orchestrate these things.
That's really good to hear, because in this industry we've seen, I don't know if you see that in Armory, but in other companies I've worked, we've always seen the challenge of selling to the telecoms versus selling to everybody else is completely different, and you're solving exactly the same problem. So stop inventing new ways of doing things. We can all come together. There are different requirements in different places, and so that leads me kind of to the next question is, where does Spinnaker help you? In which kinds of application environments have you seen it be the place to start? Where do you find the kinds of applications that in your organizations you're going to find the quick wins and start building adoption by doing a quick win and then growing from there? Is that a valid strategy, or is there another way that we should approach it? I guess I'd like to start with Richard on that.
Well, I still had answers to the old questions,
Oh, well,
but you're the moderator.
No, go right ahead.
No, one thing I was thinking about is roles kind of drive the way you use a product, because we've got roles that really don't care how artifacts come to being, right? So you think about a DevOps role that's handling the operations to deploy a product. You got a Docker image that shows up. They're thinking about that Docker image and how it gets best deployed. So I think roles, you may not even know there's a Jenkins out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think this conference, we're very technical, so we know this Jenkins thing and the Spinnaker thing, but I think there's other roles, release managers, that may not even know this thing that's called Jenkins, right? They're very focused on Spinnaker. And now the question was, what was
the question was CI or CD, which one comes first?
Oh, okay, so for us, right, we've got this Pivotal Cloud Foundry platform internally, right? And we can do a much better job at orchestrating the deployment of those applications. So today we use Jenkins that does some things for that platform, and we've worked with our partners in Pivotal that have done a nice job to extend the capability. And Spinnaker does some nice things that we'd have to script up in Blue-Green, for instance. We've got it scripted, but it's fragile, right? So it gets back to that point of first-class citizen and how it treats the deployment strategies, and Spinnaker does really well there versus, again, we've scripted it, it breaks in Jenkins. And then having something like Pivotal and a cloud driver that does something in a repeated way, in a predictable way, is also a value add. And also one pipeline that does everything for a developer. Maybe I'm stretching. There's a lot of friction in our process today where you'll push the application, but there's services you have to create, a MariaDB, a MySQL database, and you want to be able to have a seamless deployment experience where you deploy the app, you deploy the service, you can bind the app, and then you can also roll back. So
you kind of hit on something interesting here, because you're kind of saying use the right tool for the right job, given the skill set and capabilities of the platform that you're using. Not necessarily, there's not necessarily a white line, essentially, between the CI and the CD in that sense. It's like, Pivotal does a lot more things in the CD sense on its own, and then you're treating Spinnaker as kind of an orchestrator over that.
Well,
in that
Kubernetes
sense.
and Draft does similar things that
Yeah.
Cloud Foundry does with build packs for the platform, but I don't think we all have this figured out. That's what's so great about this conference, and I hear some of the answers, and I see the eyes, and everybody's going, well, they don't really understand what's going on, because I know the answer, right? This is complex stuff. This whole CD space is so new to us. Ethan?
Yeah, Ethan has something to add.
Yeah, I mean, so the whole concept of what orchestrator is responsible for doing what is really interesting to me, because to Richard, to your point, it really, it comes down to the best tool for the best job, right? So I think the reason that, this is probably a really simplified way to put this, but the reason that Kubernetes exists is because we tried to do maybe we tried to do the Jenkins way of scheduling stuff on a node, right? And we found out that we actually need a platform that is smarter for that. But then we kind of invented this new problem where we now need a way to interact with that platform. And so I think one of the reasons that I think that Spinnaker or something like it may be the position, or may be the best place to kind of do all this orchestration, is because there's a lot of information coming from both sides of the line there. So Spinnaker kind of sits in this really unique position where we're getting a lot of feedback, or we get a lot of inputs coming from CI and from the development process, but then we got a lot of exhaust coming out of the production production running, and a lot of metrics coming out of production and stuff. And so since Spinnaker is handling a lot of the exercises around deployment and around delivering software, I think it makes sense to kind of perform a lot of orchestrations there. So part of your integration testing and stuff actually involves deploying. So doesn't it make sense that the tool you're doing deployments, even if it's not executing integration tests, it's triggering them, and that's part of where that orchestration happens.
So, why wouldn't you do that? This is maybe a controversial question, but why wouldn't you do that with, say, a plugin in Jenkins?
So I don't think that Jenkins is not the answer for that, to be totally honest. I think Spinnaker is the tool to get it out there, but then you need something that runs tests. Jenkins is really great at running tests and executing arbitrary code, like RCE as a service. But yeah, so just having the ability to trigger those things from Spinnaker, I think makes a lot of sense.
Roger.
So at Capital One, we follow a process called pre-approved releases, and during that release or release cycle, let's say we trigger a test on Jenkins, and we collect all the test results. So those test results we try to publish back to the pipeline, and then pipeline basically stores all the evidences that are required for a successful deployment. And at Capital One, the standards are even stricter, so we have to go through some kind of approval process before we deploy to production. So the pipeline basically pushes all the evidences to the correct approval process system, and then people can look at, okay, this is one artifact that was created by the pipeline, and that is going through all the phases in the pipeline. It is the correct artifact that's been tested, and test results have been collected. So then Spinnaker becomes like a bigger ecosystem than only a application deploy kind of.
So in your world, Spinnaker becomes the orchestrator of approvers, validators, sort of all of the ancillary systems that aren't even necessarily directly application related?
That's correct.
Got it. And Ben, do you have anything to add on that concept?
Yeah, I have a slightly different perspective, but I agree with everything that's kind of been said as well. So in my mind, Spinnaker interacts with all the tools that you want it to interact with, and if there's one that's not supported today, the community is pretty vibrant. You can reach out and perhaps collect a team of people to write that integration. I think the real strength of Spinnaker is the ability to put a pipeline in front of a software engineer that looks the same, whether it's deploying to Amazon or Kubernetes, and then your tools that you use underneath the covers, whether it be Jenkins or some other homegrown tool that you want to stitch into the pipelines tend to look the same. And so now your software engineers, as they move between teams, there's a familiarity in the build process. And you start to build that confidence and that speed, and then the time to market starts to increase. I'm not sure how many people here are using Spinnaker, but I've certainly noticed within my own organisation and the organisations I've spoken to that are using it, that the time to market the cadence seems to pick up once you get it settled.
Very good. Actually, that raises an interesting question. How many folks here are playing with Spinnaker at least? Can you raise your hands? Okay, how many of you are using it in sort of a pre-prod kind of way where you're running things? Okay, and how many are using it as a sort of a core part of their production pipeline? Okay, so we got like 60%, I'd say, are already doing a lot of things in production. So one of the, go ahead.
I was thinking we need to change out the panelist.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question for those people that put up their hand are using production? Who found that it has sped them up once they got everything settled? Good question.
So about half of the people who raise their hand in, for
I'm sorry,
product.
what was the question? I didn't quite catch
Sorry, Mike.
I think you can move the mic on. I don't think it's feedback.
Is it on? There we go. Yeah, who is using Spinnaker in production today and has been doing so for what they consider a reasonable amount of time and has found that their engineering process time to production has sped up as a result?
Yeah, okay. Good results.
I had
That's good.
a very similar experience to that. When I first started using Spinnaker, this was during the days of the V1 provider. I was personally getting kind of onboarded to Kubernetes, but I also had the task of onboarding the rest of our application teams. And so I think the phrase that I like to use the most is it helped me deploy more meaningful software because I didn't have to think about how to deploy it. I could actually focus on writing my application because deploying with Spinnaker was the same no matter what application I was deploying.
So that's back to Richard's point, is that there are different stakeholders in the process who have different points of view, and Spinnaker allows you to do more separation of concerns, essentially?
Right, yeah.
Very nice. Raja, did you have you're leaning forward. I thought maybe you had something to add.
So we have like a concept called separation of duties. So we try to follow that with our pipelines, and a pipeline committer is not an approver, and someone needs to approve that pipeline before you can push code through that pipeline.
So do you find that actually speeds things up, or is it just a policy that you have to have a human in the pipeline?
You need to have a human process involved in the pipeline. We try to automate a lot of things, but still there has to be some kind of human interaction.
Okay, so the way that Capital One is going about is just minimizing that to say that you have exactly the right information.
Yes, and the biggest victory in last few weeks has been getting applications onboarded to this pre-approved pipelines, which are based on the managed pipeline templates. So if applications are using those managed templates, then they get a easy onboarding and easy approval process, rather than going through some stringent criteria of validating the application follows all the processes.
So there's no
Because the pipeline is basically doing the process work for you, so you don't have to do that on your own. So that's a big win for us.
That's very cool. So I think that kind of leads to, unless anybody has more to add on this subject, I transition to the next question, which is, so how do you go about in different kinds of organizations implementing Spinnaker kind of in the right way, right? Correctly? What does it mean to sort of get the most out of this tool? Is there a sort of systematic way we can help our audience think about that? Richard wants to jump there.
Yeah, you just hide it from the developers, really, in the bank.
Yeah.
We really are doing that, right? We're getting fairly opinionated out of the gate because it's so powerful, and we're regulation heavy, right? So out of the gate, we're going to have very simple pipelines that are opinionated and defined at what they do, right? Matter of fact, I've talked a little bit about the fact that we have a deployment product that's it's reliable, scalable, 200,000 endpoints. That will be the product that actually says, Spinnaker, go do what you do well initially. And to unleash the real power, we've got a lot of work to do. So out of the gate, it'll be AIM powered by Spinnaker, just like Armory is powered by Spinnaker, right, Ethan? So yeah, so at first, very opinionated, simple pipelines. I think about the level of abstraction. We've thought about this. Do we have a chat bot that says deploy application? I heard in an earlier talk, it was Andrew Phillips, who can get very complex, but he said, look, what do developers really need to define as part of their deployment? And I was talking to T-Mobile, and they said, look, there's this image that needs to be deployed. You might have a deployment strategy. So what are the smallest ingredients that a developer could provide where you could deploy to any platform, whether it's Kubernetes or Cloud Foundry internally? And there are reasons that you're able to do that around performance, resiliency, and some other things.
Very nice. So anybody else, Fatih, do you want to add something?
The thing is, like there is no obviously single way to deploy Spinnaker correctly for all the organizations. But again, if I look from developer's perspective, since I'm a developer, like as a developer, I don't really like to jump between different systems. Like I write my code and send it to Git or GitHub or whatever we are using for code reviews. And then some stuff started doing there, like unit tests, static analysis, and so on. I look at those results from Jenkins, for example, and then it gets built into artifacts and some kind of smoke testing happens. It happens on a different system. And all these stages are done on different systems, and I have to browse through all these different places to find and get feedback to see if what I just wanted to grow some stuff for others. And I think one of the important things, at least for me, when putting Spinnaker in place, is to take the feedback from developer community to help them out, because like, okay, we have lots of testers or release managers and so on, they can go and look at things and approve things on Spinnaker, which is fine, but at the same time, it's important to take the developer feedback into account while bringing up Spinnaker and employing it for organizations, because developers live their lives through an entire pipeline, like not just on commit or on artifact level or on deployment. They have to look at things in a end-to-end way. That is like what DevOps is. You are not supposed to do only development and forget about stuff by dumping your artifacts to someone else. So it is one of the important aspects to enable developers to do this.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying that Spinnaker makes very visible to the developer the things that traditionally the operators had to care about?
Exactly.
Okay, and that is one of the strengths of
Yeah,
this platform.
yeah, and I think that should be taken into account to ensure Spinnaker is deployed
So that's
correctly.
a first-class priority
Yeah.
as you go through that. So, I don't know, anybody else have anything to add to that?
I certainly agree with some of the things that Richard was saying there at the start, and some of the things you were saying too. Is, particularly the simple, coming up with a simple use case to start with. Like if you're a company that hasn't used this yet, and what I found really beneficial as I rolled it out, because I was the guy that did it, is I went and found out all the common pain cases and found a pattern and solved that in a simple pipeline template. And then demonstrated that as the option. Like I didn't give them all the information about all the many things you can do. And then we started cutting over applications onto our pipelines, and a lot of our pipelines look very similar as a result. And now we've got to that point where we've got some maturity and people have understanding, having looked at the pipelines and starting to really understand the power of it. Now we can start to think about more complex things like pipelines running pipelines and then multi-threaded pipelines and all sorts of things happening. But that very simple use case to start with, to get everyone on board and used to the tool, and that muscle memory is really important and not to be underestimated.
Yeah, I think that reemphasizes the sort of the importance of the culture of that. So Ethan,
Yeah,
you wanted to add?
I totally agree with Richard and Ben. What we've found is kind of the most successful, and one of the ways that we kind of have worked with customers in the past is we want to go in and you want to take a look at what common patterns. I think the majority of teams are going to be deploying their applications in the same way, because I think at a certain point, there are some applications that have some special requirements, but the majority of applications are going to have very similar requirements. And so if you can find that 90% case, that helps with onboarding, and it also helps with just with the whole concept making sense, because I think a lot of times teams are brand new to this, and I talked about this a little bit in my talk earlier, but with kind of the rise of DevOps, we're seeing people who have not been introduced to more operational type work being expected to do that. And so tools like Spinnaker exist to give them the power and the ability to do those types of tasks without having to totally understand, like, I don't know, instance sizes and deploying to a VM. Like how do we bake an image, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a handful of people that really understand how that works, but we expect the majority of people to be able to produce those images. So I think Spinnaker provides the right abstractions to make it to still be powerful and make you effective, but it keeps away a lot of the complexity that is, I think, infrastructure and operations in general.
That makes a lot of sense.
So I'll add to what Ethan just said. As at Capital One, my team's responsibility is to basically onboard more applications onto our platform on Spinnaker. But at the same time, for a new users or a new line of business to move to our platform, there's a lot of education that needs to be done to them to explain them how pipelines work. Right, how you can create a freestyle pipeline or how you can use a template-based pipeline, and just to help them understand this different terminologies takes a huge amount of effort to do that.
So, how do you, in your organization, justify that effort? Like, is there a sales process that you have to do internally to convince your management that it's worth the investment to do that?
Internally, we have one team that manages Spinnaker, and we extend the code base to integrate with other Capital One services. And we have been deploying 200 applications plus with Spinnaker locally.
But how did you bootstrap that, right? Like, you had to justify initially putting some engineers who were paying attention to Spinnaker, right?
Yes, and it's a challenge every day. We have to keep taking a look at the GitHub commits that are happening on the Spinnaker repositories, and how to absorb those changes into our code base, and how to make them available to our users. So it's a never-ending challenge. But yeah, we try to keep up to it.
Very, very
interesting. And recently we had a chance to onboard a different line of business to our platform, and we are going through this process where we are educating them what Spinnaker is, how do you create different pipelines, what advantages does it bring into the.
I think that kind of segues into the next question that I was thinking of asking, which is, all of our organizations are pretty different. Like, we have different kinds of sizes, structures, degrees of engineering expertise, investments in these kinds of open source projects, whether or not we can even contribute to open source projects. So, the core of the purpose of this panel is actually to kind of open up a discussion around the ecosystem and how Spinnaker sits in the ecosystem of broader people who can contribute to it. So I think that the question I'd like us to get into is, when you're stuck, where we're implementing these processes, where do you go to get help? Like, do you go internally? Do you go externally? Do you look at the open source community? Do you look at a commercial vendor like Armory? When Rantis, who just walked in the door, like who do you talk to when it comes to getting help when you're stuck? So let's start with Richard.
I send an email to Armory or Ethan.
That's a good answer for you.
And Ethan says, hey, we have a Slack channel, right? There's a Spinnaker community and there's an Armory. No, but it's about communications at the end of the day, right? And having responsive communications, I think that's the value. And so if you happen to choose a vendor to help in that process, that may be important to you. And or, the Spinnaker community is growing. We saw it at 5,000 on the Slack channel. So being a Slack user, no doubt, being able to absorb the Spinnaker IO site, getting your hands on it and getting dirty is really a great answer. But just start getting dirty with Spinnaker and you start learning, it gets dirty back with you, right?
Right. It gets back to what I was trying to get to with Raj is how do you justify that in time investment yourself, plus how do you get help and how do you balance those things?
I was just gonna kind of add to your point about the community. So I've been really deeply involved in it's events like this that really help us grow and help us kind of get unstuck when we're stuck, right? So I'm actually really interested to talk to you after this about some of the pipelines and stuff that you've built to do kind of the regulatory stuff and some of the approvals. Because the company I was at before was going through SOC 2, and I was trying to answer a lot of those questions and build tooling around that. But it's just like having the opportunity to be in this place with everyone who's here. Because, like you said, all of our organizations are so different. But I think we all have a lot of really common problems that we need to solve. And one of Andy loves to say that we open source Spinnaker because the innovations that happen in everyone else's organization, we all benefit from that. And that's kind of the coolest thing to me.
Okay.
there are many open source communities out there like OpenStack or CNCF or Linux Foundation projects. And since I've been working with those communities quite some time, there's a lot of experience out there, and there are lots of challenges those communities face. And I hear exact same stories within Spinnaker community as well. And I believe communities should look into collaborating and coming closer more in order to solve the problems in a collaborative manner rather than Spinnaker solves this problem here and OpenStack solves another problem there. I think it is important to keep the communication channels open and enable people to come and talk about their problems. And many times people generally talk about success stories, but I think it's pretty important to talk about failures in order to help others. And this happens if there is vibrant and alive community there, so people are not afraid of talking because they will know that they are not alone in this type of problems. And that is the power of community, to enable each other, be friendly, let people talk, and try your best to help. So I think Spinnaker, what I've heard in the morning as well, becoming a really great community is really important for Spinnaker and users and other communities within ecosystem.
So in practical sense, like in this, we have Slack channels for the Spinnaker community. I believe there are also email lists. And so, how can we scale this? Because we've got the conference thing, which can only scale to such a point, and it happens once a year, or maybe if you're like OpenStack twice a year. How do we make sure that we who are participating can get unblocked quicker and learn from each other? Is Slack really the answer? Does that scale? Are there going to be groups that kind of form in this? Ben, something that.
Yeah, I really think the answer to that is this community is going to scale as community scales if everyone is willing to help someone else. So, go back to your original question about where do you go when there's a problem. Generally, first I try and have a look at configuration guides, do the usual Google search. I may get to a point where I can't figure that out, and the Armory docs too, like they solve a lot of problems. And as at the other support orgs as well, they have some really good docs out there too. But jump in the Slack channel and just say, look, I'm having this problem. If you see someone else type in there, hey, I'm having this problem, and you're like, oh, I've got that problem too, I'm just going to wait for it to answer, kind of jump into it and say, hey, yeah, I'm seeing that problem too, and it helps bubble the priority of that question up. Similarly, like I try and log into Slack maybe once a week or two, if I haven't been into there, and have a look at the questions people are asking, and if it's a question I know the answer to, I'll try and answer it. And I really think that's the solution to scale, is rather than relying on a select few group of people that are super helpful and spend the entire day just answering questions, if we all answer one or two questions here and there, I think we're going to scale.
I think that's a great point.
I think participation is critical. So you may, even like to your point, you may not know the answer to the question, but any little bit helps. Anything that you can say that might help unblock somebody, even if it's like, I'm not crazy, I'm seeing this too, so yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, my experience has been the same. If I face any problem, I first try to debug myself, get into the code, get my hands dirty. But if that does not work, then Slack channel is the thing I go to, and sometimes I get a response immediately. Sometimes it just gets lost in the trail of messages. Yeah.
Well, this is how I wonder how we scale. Right?
Yeah.
Because these things do get lost. As we get bigger, the likelihood that your issue is going to get lost gets higher, right? And so helping other people by jumping on the same things is one method. I wonder if there are other ideas. I kind of want to switch this up a little bit. We've been kind of talking amongst ourselves up here. I'm curious if there are people in the audience we have an awesome panel here, who have questions themselves that they would like to ask. I'll delegate some of my responsibility. We got a question back there.
Okay, so I work for a company, we use Spinnaker, we've had the whole Jenkins thing, and one of the things that every company I've ever worked for, CD is not the default. It's usually just kind of like, oh, we'll run a script locally to deploy this software. So at what point do you think CD will become the default that companies start to go towards? Because I think test-driven development is starting to make its roots as like, this is the default, this is how we write software. There's not really a default of, this is how we deploy software. So I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on that.
So when continuous delivery will kind of be the default? I think it's starting to become more common. I think kind of right out of the gate, a lot of newer companies coming out with newer tech are starting with there because I think it's more information is out there, right? Like how to do it well. The tooling is there, but I'm not necessarily sure that continuous, like fully automated, no humans involved will. I mean, it may become a thing eventually, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I think that's kind of some of the value of Spinnaker is that it's not just a continuous delivery platform. Once you kind of achieve efficient software delivery, it's just changing the trigger, right? It's not a human triggering something, but it's a machine triggering it. So to me that's kind of the line of continuous delivery versus software delivery is kind of who's kicking that process off.
Yeah. One of the crucial things about CI/CD is to prevent claims like what you just said. Oh, it works on my machine. I have this script here. I just execute the script and it works. And when that code piece lands in CI/CD, it doesn't. So it's basically, again, I'm going back to what I mentioned at the beginning. It's what people need to come to that mindset to ensure this is not about that person's own thing, that they contribute to something bigger than what they are doing, and they need to ensure whatever they do works for others as well. And CI/CD is there to guarantee this. And another aspect of CI/CD is to make problems painfully obvious. And if things stop working or things can't be automated, then there's a problem there, and there needs to be something to be done to fix that problem by, for example, taking those scripts from that guy and making it available to the entire organization and pushing them onto CI/CD environment to make them part of CI/CD. And okay, the question you ask, like how we can make continuous delivery default, but again, it has to start with the CI part, and it should continue towards CD part to get people in same type of thinking.
Yeah, think about the type of applications you're deploying as well, right? Your own microservices, cloud native, immutable infrastructure. Many businesses have many other application types deploying to mainframe. So I think the answer to that type of question is it's really about your application architectures and the number of applications and that level of complexity. And then we talked a lot about, the orchestrator. And then we start talking about business process and release orchestration within the bank. So I think there's a lot to consider in terms of just automating yourself into a platform and deploying applications. I think we're all starting to find our way there. This Jenkins thing's been out there, the Swiss Army knife, and we've all known about it. But we're starting to learn about how do I orchestrate my releases? How do I model my releases? How do I deploy to cloud and maybe hybrid platforms, which we happen to have virtual servers and some AIX and some mainframe, and they're starting to remodel parts of their application, but not all of it. And we'd love to give the continuous delivery experience to all those platforms because these apps aren't going to, let's call, morph into cloud native architectures right out of the gate. But Spinnaker is really cool.
Yeah, everyone's sort of got me thinking about something quite important is that one thing that Spinnaker encourages you to do is to do immutable deployments. And so that means not changing production outside of the pipeline. So Spinnaker itself, like even if it's a CI pipeline with a manual judgment step, Spinnaker should be doing the deployment to production. And that process in itself helps you then to walk the CD path if you want to. Because that manual judgment step, now you can make a decision as an engineering org, do I want to solve what needs to be solved to take that step out? That
So
also...
that's a carrot and a stick kind of approach?
Yeah,
Let's put the stick there and then let's give the carrot a way to solve it? So
Absolutely, and like that manual notification can be a Slack message. We have it as a Slack message. It pops up in engineering teams Slacks. It can be yes, no, do I want to go forward? but removing access for engineers to run a script or something, to do something outside of that pipeline to the production server is something I'd highly recommend to get the most out of Spinnaker.
Makes a ton of sense. Raja, do you have anything to add to that?
So at Capital One, we follow you build your own process. So every team basically works to bring efficiency into it, and if they see other teams doing it, so they follow.
Nice. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, 5 different ways.
Isn't that the goal of the panel? All right, anybody else have a question they want to get answered from these awesome experts?
When you've had to extend Spinnaker for your respective companies, has the existing UI worked well? What's been good and what hasn't about like creating a new view to add new functionality?
Yes, when we initially onboarded to Spinnaker, I think maybe Cam here, he's my team member. He can answer this question very well because I've been with Capital One around 1.5 years, but his journey started very well before that.
There you go.
Welcome to the panel.
Come on up.
Yes, in our early adoption, we found that the data model for the application configuration, if you will, was lacking in particular to what Capital One needed. We need to capture information of the application for attributes that define its CI component in our kind of CI management storage. And so by default, we couldn't make use of the as-is application configuration page. It was very limited. There were only 3 views of 3 attributes available. So we had to extend the data model and then slap on top of that our own UI in order to capture that data. We also found the need to provide some level of access control to the pipeline view as well, to whom can execute, who can click the button, and who can see the details of the execution. So we overlay certain kind of permissions into deck, if you will, on enabling such kind of sort of like control access as well.
So to turn this into a community discussion, you guys did some things in Spinnaker, which, you know, the awesome structure of Spinnaker makes that possible. Now, you know, did you have the alternative to go outside? Were there other people who were looking at similar problems, or are you contributing these things back to Spinnaker?
To be frank, at that juncture, we didn't find a peer that had the same challenge that we were subjected to.
Sure.
We also were, if not the first fintech organization to adopt Spinnaker, so we were pioneering that journey for a financial institution as well.
Great.
So our findings were essentially brand new to the community.
Got it.
But now we are evolving, and we see that certain decisions that we took 2 years ago were not the right ones. So we want to go back and try to work on existing UI and extend that UI rather than build our own on top of it. And at the same time, backend services, we want to add more extension models to that rather than changing those because it becomes a day-to-day merge issue with upstream code base. And we also plan to contribute back. We just need to go through certain approval processes at Capital One. Once approved, yes, we would be starting to contribute.
Anybody else on the panel have anything to add to that question? Go ahead.
You start to get a little scared in terms of that model, right? Because our company has, like many companies, got a lot of developers and a lot of bandwidth, and you can do a lot of things to these engines, right? And then you got to be careful that you don't morph them in a way that you can't leverage. I think this is pretty basic conversation, but you got to be very careful. I think the UI though is a place you can extend it fairly well. You know, tags and things will be important in the platform for just generic pieces, and then there may be some what I'll call more general ways to integrate attributes into the UI frame that can be improved. But I also think a lot of times the fastest route to adding capability is do it yourself. Then how do you involve the community in that decision, right? How do you say, hey, I'd like to have this particular attribute We all want that attribute. It comes from a Jenkins job. Can we show it? It's not always that simple, but it can be very tough when you get a lot of capability within your own business units to do some things. You hire a lot of staff and you start to be the Spinnaker experts.
It's tempting to make your own fork. Right?
Yes, yes.
That's dangerous. Don't do that. Great. Anybody else? Okay, so I think we're at the end of the time. I really want to thank our panel. Let's all thank them for